Hey everybody, we're back. My name is Rochelle.
And I'm Erin.
And we're trying something new today. So we have been thinking about topics and thinking about podcasting, thinking about videos. So we're just going to kind of wing it and see what happens today. We have our cow back. We're very stoked to have our cow.
A little trivia question for y'all. Why are we having a thematic cow? Anyway, we'll just let you think about that. Completely unrelated to what we're actually going to be talking about today. So
yeah. So you were talking, we were trying to kind of come up with themes, and one of the pieces that you brought forward was talking about fluency. Mm-hmm. And I thought that that was a great topic to try and cover because fluency, well, of course you're fluent or people speak English or you must speak Spanish or what, it's just a kind of a broader picture. And so we thought we'd break that down a little bit for you.
Yeah. So what kind of struck in my mind and why this came to mind for me is, there'll be sometimes when we'll be checking in at an appointment and talking with the front desk registration, PSR, whatever title, you have for those individuals. And, they might indicate that, the patient has already arrived and, but they spoke English perfectly well. I don't really think that they need an interpreter.
Yeah, duh.
Or they'll push through an appointment and say, oh, well, they've already registered, they did good with themselves, so they're back in with the nurse already, and I don't think we need you, And so it's concerning because sometimes people will have an idea that somebody speaks a language really well, really fluently, because they can speak those things really well and really fluently in very targeted, very specific settings.
Right. So I always look at it like on the patient side, so a patient who you've requested an interpreter for, they might be able to talk to their neighbor really well. Mm-hmm. And they might be able to be in a work environment super easy. But people forget the complexities of healthcare. Mm-hmm. And so the other thing that happens is nobody wants to seem quote unquote stupid. And so nobody's gonna, if you're moving them along in the encounter, they're just going to roll with it and do the best that they can. But there's a lot of other things that may be happening in their mind that are kind of red flags, I guess. Mm-hmm.
So language is very complex. And to date, I've never met a human being who has been able to read another person's mind or to know what another person knows. We verify knowledge and understanding through communication. Mm-hmm. And so when we don't have communication that has... when we don't have ways to read somebody else's mind, the only way we can understand or verify understanding is just through communication, asking a question, and then having the person maybe explain back or do something that really verifies that they've understood, just like you would in a monolingual encounter.
Yeah. And the other thing that happens too is that people will say, well, do you want an interpreter? No, I don't want an interpreter. But understanding that the interpreter is really there for the healthcare providers. So the job is really complex. There's a lot of years of schooling. There's a lot of ongoing training. We'll get to that later. We're excited to talk about education. But there's a lot that goes into the encounter itself. And so an interpreter isn't there necessarily to help the patient or support the patient's needs. They're there to help and support the provider needs. So in healthcare, it can be something as simple as I have a runny nose that won't stop, or I have an ongoing cough, or I stubbed my toe, or I need stitches. Those are all pretty, in the world of healthcare, you could almost look at them as pretty straightforward issues. But the cough may turn into a complex respiratory issue that may turn into imaging that, finds something on the lung, which may lead into oncology or pulmonology or any of the more complex things. So healthcare is unique and beautiful in that way, and that it starts with one thing, but the point of it is to get to the root cause, and that can be complex. And so an interpreter isn't there to be a friend to the patient. Yes, they speak that language. Yes, they understand that culture, but they're there for the healthcare providers so that they can do their job. And it's really important at every single point. And so that's something to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, being able to assess somebody's proficiency in a language, and we're focusing on maybe how well the patient speaks English to be able to register, we can apply these same concepts to the medical care team who maybe has learned Spanish or has learned French or has learned other languages. Even in that context, there's a variety of level of proficiency.
Yep.
So we want to be careful that we don't over apply or assess our own or somebody else's ability to communicate effectively just because they're able to ask where the bathroom is very well and with no accent. Wow, that was great. Or just because they're able to say what their address and phone number is and emergency contact individuals.
Yeah. And so really the key that I'm hearing is that you don't want to assess somebody's fluency at registration, because it's in the exam room where things get far more complex, and that's where the interpreter may really be needed. However, because of timelines and how quickly somebody is roomed or pulled back, it's really just starting the encounter with the interpreter so that everything goes smoothly and nobody has to worry about it. And if they see from the get-go there's an interpreter present, they're going to be so much more relaxed. That's what we want. That's healthcare's goal, is to have patients come in and feel comfortable and relaxed and calm, trust their environment, trust their providers, and that's really what an interpreter is there for. I'm thinking of, I have two examples that come to mind on this topic. One is, there was an example of a patient who, and I've been in encounters with them, where the patient speaks English well, and they'll respond to the doctor, and there'll be a dialogue where there isn't much interpreting needed, but sometimes in critical points it would be. And the patient is, you would assume they're fluent, but they've been appreciative of having an interpreter because they weren't certain they were understanding everything. They weren't certain that they were able to communicate everything. And that's really where interpreting comes in too, is how easy is it to communicate? If you have to rethink how you're going to say something, or I'm not going to use this word because it's too complex. I still talk with my host family from Argentina, and I'll practice English with my sister, and I'll find myself changing how I shape my English with her, even though she's totally fluent. I could be put my so's, my sassy words, my sarcasm. She gets it, but I find myself consciously changing how I express myself with her because it is her second language. And I know they do that with me too, even though I can talk about philosophy and politics and religion and all of the complex, philosophical, deep things that you don't talk about at the holiday table, right? I can do all of that, but they still adjust for me. And I'll find if I'm talking to one of their spouses or a friend, it's so much faster. I'm like, whoa, working the brain here. So you really do adjust, and you might not even know it. But that's when you're in a healthcare encounter, it's all about time, resources, efficiency, effectiveness. And an interpreter can provide that if it's done well. So fluency has...
Yep. And when we're thinking of, I want to hone in on that effectiveness component as well, because when you are feeling that you're adjusting the way that you're thinking so that you can express the thoughts that you have in words that are meaningful for yourself or words that you think will be meaningful for the other person, acknowledge that you've just added another layer of cognitive processing into what would otherwise be a natural flow of communication. So whether you're doing that yourself when communicating with somebody else, or putting the other person on the spot of having to think harder because it's not their primary language, in the context in which stress is already present because they're worried about their own health, they're worried about their kids' health, what have you, you're really setting somebody up to fail in the long term. Yes, I got it, I understood it in the moment, but I was thinking through the second language. And so now when I went home and I had to remember what the instructions were, now it's that much harder. And sure, having been there, do I even remember that all this information that I have questions about is on my discharge information, which is in English, because you're processing things so much more complexly because of the context in the scenario. So to expect somebody with who doesn't have the level of fluency that would be required to be effective and efficient in that context, to work in a language that they're not as strong in, that's adding an unnecessary layer of challenge in an already challenging situation.
Absolutely.
When you have interpreters who are there to make sure people understand from the get-go, but then again, I'm struck by the story that you shared. It brought to mind an example that I had too, where the patient appeared to be understanding the questions, and the questions really were not that hard. So it was reasonable that, I'm pretty sure, it would seem reasonable that the patient has understood. It was in the context of caring for a child. This is like, I don't know, the third, fourth child for the person. So at any rate, long story short, it would have been reasonable to conclude that the individual had understood the doctor's question. But I'm there to interpret, so I interpret anyway, thinking I'm just kind of spilling up space here, and how useful is this, and what have you, like these little side conversations that maybe you have inside your brain, right? But the striking moment of that was when I had interpreted the question, which was a yes/no thing, and Mom was responding in English to the English question, right? I should say. She was nodding yes, 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 but politely, listening to my interpretation. And all of a sudden her, oh, yes, 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 turned into, oh, no, 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 no. Because of whatever nuance of how the question was phrased, she misunderstood it in the English, even though she seemed to be pretty fluent. So, again, we really don't understand, can't verify understanding unless we've had effective communication.
Right. And going back to the other example, when going back to on the provider side, so you studied and you say that you speak Spanish or French or Arabic, Chinese, Swahili, whatever it is, right? I had a wonderful doctor that I worked with at the very, very beginning of my career, and he was the kindest, sweetest man. And it was a challenge to interpret in his appointments, because he would always have an interpreter present, but he would use those visits as his way to practice Spanish. So he had a really heavy accent. It was really basic Spanish. He was like, it was dredging. So an appointment that was scheduled for, let's say, 20 minutes would take like an hour and a half. And he wouldn't just let me interpret. It was, I was there, and then it was like he would say something in Spanish, and then I'd have to ask him like, what is it that you're asking? And then he'd tell me in English, and then I'd have to interpret that. And so it just really, it was good that he had me there so that he could communicate everything and like get what the patient was saying, but at the same time, like he would listen to the patient. Oh yeah, I understood. But then he'd like, oh, did I? And then he'd ask me. And so it just became this long, drawn out, unnecessary thing. On our website, I wrote a book, an ebook or a paper or something years ago called talking about patients not being crash test dummies. And that's really what it boils down to, is in an effort to save money, or we don't like the interpreters, or the machines are too far away, or we can't get somebody in the language, or we're just gonna get through it. There's so many things you miss, and it's like, even as you shared your example with the mom, like third kid, yep. I'm a mom of 3, and they couldn't be any more different in an encounter. And so fluency, using an interpreter, the value of it really is that efficiency and just ease. It's like, it just makes it easy. It just makes it easy. If it doesn't, then that's another, that's a whole nother topic. But really, it's the check-in point or a phone call to make an appointment isn't the point at which it should be decided whether an interpreter is needed or not. And if an interpreter is there, use them.
Yeah.
Just use them.
Yep.
If you want to make a different decision afterwards, if you want to speak to the patient and say, hey, do you want an interpreter for the next visit? But really get feedback from the provider, from the healthcare provider that they're there to see, and see how they think it went and what they think, because that's really the meat and potatoes, if you will, Maybe that's a reference to our cow here, meat and potatoes. But that's really where it comes down to is using an interpreter, and just let it be easy. Because if it's easy, it's efficient, it's timely, it just runs better. And there's so many things as a patient you're listening to, and you're worried about yourself, you're worried about your kids. You might have 3 kids with you because they're all, none of them are in school, back-to-back appointments. This one needs to color. You might be there with mom or dad who are scared of something. I mean, there's just so many things as a patient. If you put yourself in their shoes as a patient, going to the doctor for whatever it is they're going into, how would you feel? What emotions are you experiencing? What's your stress level? And then add the complexities of language onto that. It's just, could go on for days and days and days about that one. Yeah. So, yeah. So that's fluency. Don't judge a book by its cover.
That's right. And understand that fluency levels will fluctuate depending on the context and the scenarios, situations.
Yeah. So do you have any other, we've given some scenarios. Do you have any appointments or things that stick out to you? You were at a surgery not long ago in a facility that didn't usually use our services, and you had a different experience, I think, with the floor staff and versus the clinical side and how they use the interpreter. It was
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the thread of relevance to flush out. This part is not for recording and publication.
Yeah. No, but it was, I think they were having, so I'm going to see if I can remember the scenario right. It was a patient who had to be awake during the procedure, and they didn't have you come into the procedure room. And so then you had feedback from the patient once they were roomed, right? Mm-hmm. So...
Sorry, I'm leaving you hanging on this one.
Okay.
Sorry.
So, no, that's okay. What else did we say we were going to talk about? Oh, how to become an interpreter.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. All right. So, another thing that has been kind of a hot topic on our videos is how to become an interpreter. And there's so many different ways, but one of the things that I thought would be kind of fun is to think about how I became an interpreter, how Connecting Cultures continued to evolve its education, and gives kind of some ideas about what you can do if you want to get into the field. Because it seems like people are really hesitant and worried about what's needed and how you go about it. And there's so many ways. There's some people who don't care, and they just do whatever they think it should be without research or like looking into anything. There's some people that go on to...
That's not the way to do it.
Yeah, don't do that. There's some people that will go on to hire, a master's program or something like that. And so you really run the gamut from, hey, I'm helping my community, and so I'm just going to be there because I feel good about helping, to... I'm going now to study for a master's degree. I didn't graduate college. Aaron did. So we have different journeys, but even on our team, there's a whole gamut of educational background. And so there are other things that you can do to become an interpreter. Mm-hmm. So...
Yeah, so even taking a look at where am I at currently in my life. So some of the questions that we'll get are, I have this background. I am a physician. I have this master's degree in particular language studies, but with no translating or interpreting, Mm-hmm. And so it's important to realize that the background as a nurse or any other medical professional is nice. Obviously the bilingual skills are required, but those, or I've been bilingual my entire life. Sometimes the term there will be heritage speaker, and these are important building blocks, stepping stones to entering into the profession, but understanding that simply because somebody has achieved a medical degree does not automatically equate to then having the skills to be an interpreter. They're very different skill sets.
One of the things that I would suggest if you're looking into this is there's a few organizations that we can list below, but we here train with the National Council on Interpreting in Healthcare, NCIHC's Code of Ethics and Standards of Practice. So if you're watching this video or listening to this podcast and you're like, where do I start? Looking up Interpreter Code of Ethics is a really good way, because those are documents, they're researched, they took years to develop, and anyone that you pick is they're different but similar. So even looking at the different ones.
IMIA, CHIA, and other organizations, even from different countries.
Yeah. And that would be a really good way to start to understand like what your role is as an interpreter. So being bilingual is a huge accomplishment. There's people, who would die for that. So just that, you're already winning. You're already winning. But looking into Interpreter Code of Ethics or Healthcare Interpreter Code of Ethics is going to be a really good start for you to start doing some self-study, because if you don't have formal access, or there's not training programs that you have, or the investment is too much or something like that, your skill set that you're going to need is self-study. It's going to be research.
Yeah, and of course, as technology evolves and different understanding of how to acquire skills, access to different things certainly changes. So it is important to have a formal process of study, in particular if certain employers are going to require that you have achieved a formal course of study. So it might affect your opportunities for employment, and then of course to advance on to achieving certification as well is another consideration. So the thing that a class will do that learning, kind of on the fly or by trial and error. And believe me, I love the field learning experience. There's limitations to class learning, and just like there's limitations to field experience. So the best of both worlds, really, to come to this point would be to marry both of them. So if you're doing a short course because that's all that you have available to you, that is certainly more valuable than not doing anything at all. Because what you can get through a course, thinking about how it's designed and what content it is as well, is it will present you information and ideas and consideration, topics, areas of domain knowledge, etc. That
Can you tell she's a trainer?
That you didn't necessarily even consider as being part of the framework.
Yeah.
So what I was thinking about when you were mentioning, like, even just doing the self-study for the Code of Ethics and thinking about the role and really understanding the role, that can be a really important thing for folks to even consider to determine, is this really for me?
That's what I was going to say. Absolutely. That'll just introduce you to all these different aspects and think, okay, I'm bilingual. I'm going to interpret. Yeah. Everything's on video. Just going to, or there's somebody hiring or whatever, right? I'm just going to go do this. Get to the Code of Ethics and do some self-study and research, and you're like, ooh, not that.
I have to interpret everything that everybody's saying, like they're saying it, and not how I want to say it.
Like they're yelling,
do that.
So I have to yell, or they're swearing, so I have to swear. Yeah.
Or somebody's giving somebody really bad advice, and hey, I have my own opinion on things, and wait a second, my opinion doesn't apply.
Yeah.
And, so there are things that, especially for folks who have interpreted for family or friends, and that's and believe me, you get good skills in that.
Yes.
That is, there's value in that. But to cross that to the next phase into professional interpreting, sometimes that's the sticking point, is not being aware of not only what the role is, but the why behind the role.
Right. And so So I have two things that I don't want to lose. One is going to be the first person, but before I get to that, understanding the why behind the role and the construct around it is really what differentiates an ad hoc or a helper from a professional. And as a professional interpreter, it gives you your boundaries so that you can take yourself out of it. It's like, okay, I'm operating within this context because this is my role. Just like the person who registers patients, they're not rooming them. They're not, taking vitals. They're not, assessing and triaging the encounter. They're not the healthcare provider. They're not taking x-rays or running the CT machine or doing an angiogram or delivering babies. Everybody in healthcare has a role. And so really understanding the interpreter role within healthcare, there's people that would be brilliant interpreters, but just don't operate well in healthcare. It's not their environment. So understanding that, I think, is really important, and doing some research will help you.
Yeah. So another point to consider when entering the journey of pursuing a career as a healthcare interpreter is knowing that whatever level of formal preparation, formal education, education you've achieved, a certification, etc. It's never ending, and it's ongoing.
Yeah.
And it can't be done only in a classroom. It has to also have real life field work.
Did it die?
We're dead.
Okay. Do you want to keep saying your idea and record it?
Yeah, the audio's still going.
Oh, the audio's still
still
going?
Audio's going to be going forever because I'm plugged in, but we
Oh,
just have no
okay.
camera on it anymore.
Well, we can keep that going then.
Well, in that case.
Right? Now we can relax. So you were talking, so for those of you listening, we were recording video at the same time and our camera died. So now we're slouched in our chairs, kicked back, and we're going to keep carrying on with the conversation. So you were saying how learning is really a never-ending process.
It's a never-ending process, and the act of interpreting in healthcare is you have to do field work. You have to perform the function in the real context. So this actually is an applicable statement. Is it applicable or applicable?
I think it depends. It's like potato.
All right, well, we'll just go with it. It's a thing to which it can be applied, hitherto and henceforth, to even the different modalities of interpreting. So if you're interpreting and you're doing, hundreds of hours of role play in a classroom setting, you're definitely going to gain some real valuable, hopefully, and important skills. But if you take that hundreds of hours of role play practice and now you're in your first real life encounter in a healthcare clinical setting, you're still going to have to adjust to the dynamics of working with new people.
Yeah.
The dynamics of sight, sounds, and smells, and the environment being very, very different. So your brain is going to have a lot more to deal with than it had been with all the hundreds of hours of classroom role play scenario. So the classroom role play scenario is very important to developing the skill set, to kind of what I like to call developing the interpreter brain, where it does come more automatically to identify when you need to start interpreting because your memory capacity is at maximum, or practice the skill of interpreting in first person, because for most people that doesn't come naturally, right? Yep. And so you kind of get that interpreter brain kind of locked in where it comes naturally, and then you transition into a real world setting where you have all sorts of other variables and input that is affecting your cognitive processing. So at any rate, to have the real world experience coupled with the classroom scenario is essential.
Yeah, that's the ideal, and that's what we're fortunate enough to be able to do here at Connecting Cultures. As new interpreters come on, and their first week, bless them, because it's, intensive classroom, and that leads right into field work
Shadowing
and
yeah.
shadowing, where you're not, as a new interpreter, you don't go into the field on your own fresh. You observe senior interpreters who are trained on how to mentor you through the process and get you up to speed. Then the roles switch, and then you're shadowed so that there's that kind of safety net. But we give you all of the preparation to get that interpreter brain working. But going back to the first person, if we're looking at how to become an interpreter, that would be my second thing to have people do is, research and start to understand the role and the context in which you're working and what it is as a job and a profession. But then start practicing parroting. Start practicing saying exactly back to somebody what they say to you, or have them say I statements like, oh, I hurt my knee when I slipped on the ice getting out of my car. Oh, I hurt my knee when I slipped on the ice getting out of my car. Even English to English, Spanish to Spanish, you don't even necessarily have to have a different language set. You don't have to have target and I don't know.
Source and target.
Start and target, thank you. But just using those I statements, because there's a complexity when we try and distance our personal selves from the message. That's why we say, well, I was talking to my daughter and she said blah, blah, blah. Well, you don't want to say all of the, I was talking to my daughter and she said blah, blah, blah. There's so much more complexity to it, and it takes away the message. And the other key and critical component of interpreting is having that pure message and staying true to the original context. And so using those I statements, I think, and getting into that first person is probably one of the bigger challenges when people first come on and start interpreting, because it feels really, really weird. It feels really weird to say, if you're dealing with somebody who's not a matching gender, or a 2-year-old said, oh, I have a boo-boo, and you have to say, oh, I have a boo-boo, or whatever. It just feels weird. It's different. But cognitively, that's been kind of a big word we've been talking about, it just makes it so much easier. So that would be the other thing that I would recommend practicing, is just using that first person.
Yeah. Memory skills as well. So interpreters in medical settings, dialogue settings, you have two people communicating with each other through the interpreter. There's going to be a natural back and forth exchange. So a lot of time, the interpreter will interpret consecutively, so not interpret while somebody is talking. The first person, the first individual speaks, pause, the interpreter interprets that message so that the second participant can respond to that. And so there's a turn taking in the consecutive mode, which has its pros and cons, as every mode does, but it definitely taxes the memory in a way that people don't use in normal life.
No.
So that would be another skill to kind of think about working on, is developing your memory and recall skills.
Yeah, because it happens very, very real time. And that's a skill that people, after time in the field and after time being able to use that skill, the memory recall gets a lot stronger. You'll see that with people new into the profession, and the memory recall skills, even with all the practice, all the prep, all of the everything in real life. That's where Code of Ethics allows you to clarify if you missed part of the message or you can't remember. Asking back, okay, you said A, B, and then 1, 2, 3, and clarifying so that you're making sure that you're still conveying all of the information. But that's definitely it's really a neat process to go through and watch and see. Is just, you kind of think back and reflect on it. You're like, dang, like that's some skill. So that's kind of fun to watch. So how to become an interpreter? Ideally, you want to be able to find some type of formal training. But if that isn't in the works for you, doing some research on, code of ethics. There's or associations that are out there. You can find one close to you. They'll offer different trainings, workshops. Facebook, Twitter, all the social media have a lot of really great organizations out there with lots of different members that can help. So it's really just the first step to becoming an interpreter, I would say, is just investigating.
Yeah.
But then also don't be afraid of it. Just don't be afraid. It's like, learning to ride a bike, or, it's a decision, and anything's hard in the beginning. But you don't have to feel so daunted that it's an impenetrable place to be, and it's very, very fulfilling. So we've been doing it a lot of years for a reason.
Yeah. So if you think you might even be remotely interested in exploring it, go for it.
Yeah.
There's a great need for skilled medical interpreters.
Yeah.
I'll just comment a little bit too to underscore it. It will continue to get harder and harder, and rightly so, to find employment, to be effective, and for your own professional liabilities, etc., to proceed without having any formal training. That kind of has been the history of our profession, but fortunately that has changed a lot. So the access to training has certainly gotten a lot more prevalent.
Yeah.
And so it to speak without a filter, there's really kind of no excuse anymore.
Yeah,
to be
that's
out there
true.
without getting any initial training, but to certainly use the things that we talked about to augment, because training programs sometimes do have different limitations, and you maybe didn't get as much as you would have liked to have or would have been necessary. We had somebody comment recently that they finished a training program and now they are in the field and they're like, wait a second, I need more.
Yeah.
So it is an ongoing process, and you'll certainly get there. But it is an absolutely wonderful and rewarding thing. And you use the riding a bike analogy. I'm thinking about it like learning to play the piano.
Yeah. That's a better analogy than riding a bike.
Well, not necessarily, but only in this sense. In that, I can tinker away at the keys, and my sister and I, we both had to learn to play piano growing up and took piano lessons. My sister is phenomenal on the piano as compared to me. But we both gave it a try, right? So I know that this is not the career path for me, but at least I gave it a try. And I can tinker at it, but you don't want me to be your concert pianist.
Right.
So the same thing, with interpreting, you maybe have some certain tendencies, some certain indications or skills that this would be a great career path for you. So explore it. What's the worst that's going to happen?
Yeah. But the other thing that to the counter to that, or the opposite side of the coin, if you will, and for anybody who knows me or doesn't know me, I suck at analogies, and I'll put all of my ducks in a basket and all of my birds in a row, or eggs in a row. See, I can't even I'm messing up. But anyways, the opposite to being in the profession and being in a professional that is harmful to the profession and the work that we do are people who dabble in it or do it once in a while, or are, I have, some free time over here, so I'll interpret, but they're not in the field enough. And I think that does a huge disservice to healthcare, because if you don't use it, you lose it, right? So in your piano analogy, you might really suck at piano now. Where if your sister continued on, she's still really good, or she got better. So not that you suck, because you're still better than me, because I don't know how to play the piano at all.
Well, to the point of the dabbling in it is certainly not to dabble and then go into the field, but rather for those who are wondering if this is the right profession for me, if this is the right career path for me.
Yeah.
The dabbling part, the figuring it out, the trying it out part would be in researching.
Yeah.
To really understand what is required of an interpreter, talking with other interpreters who are in the field. And then through a training program where it is low risk.
Yeah.
As far as you're not, providing your service in a real medical context or scenario, that's where you can kind of, have the safety nets up to explore, is this truly the career that I want to pursue? Is this really the right fit for me?
Yeah. The other thing, as we're talking about healthcare and becoming an interpreter, that I think people kind of freak out about is like the body, blood, like smells and sounds and sights and different things. And one of the things that I realize with myself, and I tell new people, is that once you become trained and you're in the field, you really, and I think this might be true for all of healthcare, anybody that's in the healthcare profession, you learn how to separate like the biology from the person. It becomes where it's, we had to do a translation for an autopsy one year. That was the way, never forget that. That's probably in a video somewhere, when we translated that. But it was a really, heartfelt moment. But at the same time, it had imagery with it. And so it was like, there was the shock of this father. So the story is, since we're podcasting and we can...
And I'm just going to clarify, just because people might not be sensitive to translating versus interpreting. So truly translating, it is a written document translation of an autopsy, not interpreting an autopsy being performed.
Correct. So yes. So interpreting is the spoken language, translation is the written. And so it was a translation. And what had happened, the story is that, from my perspective, I was with my daughter and we were in the car and going to have dinner, and I get a call from our accountant, and my daughter's in here with us. She's like, that was me. And I had a call from our accountant who was like, oh my gosh, Rochelle, like, this gentleman walked through the door, said he was with some like chemical company or something like that, and had a document that he needed translated. And the person who received the translation and talked to that gentleman was actually our IT guy. So again, it was like New Year's Eve of 2017 is when it was. And so you, Erin, were in the Valley office and I was in Green Bay. And so the IT guy gets a hold of the accountant and says, hey, I have this document. She's like, okay, send it to me and I'll do the quote. And so then she calls me and she's like, oh my gosh. She's like, it's a dead body. She's like, there's an image, and she freaked out. Freaked out. She was so distraught because in an autopsy report, there's imagery that goes with the report. And so I'm freaking out and trying to calm everybody down. So my daughter and I pass the restaurant we were driving to and we proceed to the office. And I take a look at the document, and I got nothing from the IT guy. And so I call the gentleman because I'm like, why is this like chemical company having us requesting a translation of an autopsy report, and what's going on? And so what it ended up being is it was from a father. I might tear up a little bit as I tell the story because it was very emotional. But it was a father whose daughter had died while on her honeymoon years ago outside of the country. And he was trying to understand what actually happened because he wasn't confident that what he was receiving was indeed the facts. And so he had this autopsy sent to him, and he was carrying it with him for months, not having it translated, but he wanted it translated so he could understand exactly what happened to his daughter. And so I remember calling you. I'm like, okay, Erin, this is new, because that doesn't come across our table every day. And I'm like, do we do this? And at first it was the emotion, because I'm listening to this gentleman explaining his story, and he was so disconnected from the imagery that was on the report, because you're looking at dissection and different things, and he was so hardened to it. And it was his baby on the table. And it just struck me, and we talked about it, and there was the emotion behind it. But then our professional brain kicked in. And it's like, then you start looking at it as the words on the page, and the imagery is the biology of a body. And it was very scientific. It was it wasn't graphic in nature, like, crime scene photos might be or something like that. It was very just black and white, fact driven, and we were able to do this for this gentleman. But it's, I always say that we do everything from birth to death and everything in between. But to me, that's the beauty of being an interpreter. When we were done, I'm tearing up because my daughter's like literally like right in front of me. But we were driving after everything was settled and we were good. We were driving home we actually drove back to the restaurant we were intending to go to. And she's like, Mom, I don't know how you can do this. Like, how can you, I would never be able to work in this field. And it's like, I look at it for me personally, like God gave me a gift. He gave me a plan. I ended up in 1995 in Mendoza, Argentina, no email, $4 a minute phone calls, like middle of, as far away from home as I could go, met a beautiful family who took me in like their own, friendships, and it shaped my life. And I was given this skill and this talent. Never thought that I would end up here. I always thought I'd be in Argentina, and I still live 20 minutes from my small town that I grew up in, but doing such amazing work and meeting people and hearing stories and seeing couples and families. And it's like there's people who were in with their last days, and it's such an impactful profession, because if you think about it, the story that I'm retelling you with the autopsy, like that gentleman needed that closure. He needed that information. Mm-hmm. And so while personally for us to look at the document or look at the imagery might affect you, you're doing something for somebody. You're fulfilling a need in a human being. And to me, that's the beauty of interpreting. I just think, I had a close friend of mine's father passed away, and it was, there was some hospital stays involved, and it was kind of messy. And I remember her husband looking at me going, I don't know how anybody can work in healthcare. And I just thought about what we were going through as a family, and then imagining what that would be like if you couldn't communicate. Mm-hmm. If you couldn't understand what was going on. You have the stress and the sadness and the emotions, and your brain is every which way. And if you were in an environment that you couldn't communicate basic things, or you couldn't communicate complex things, or your needs or your wants or anything like that, like how horrible would it be? So yes, interpreting is a lot about, going to do a physical or, well child check, or, there's things that are more common. But the role of an interpreter is so that you can also be there for those complex moments and allow people to be human. Because really we started off this conversation with fluency and how it's hard to judge, where that is. And it's like life is not clean, simple, every day. Healthcare is getting more and more rigid. There's metrics, there's there's measurements, there's expectations, there's bottom dollars, it's a complex system if we look at healthcare as an industry and a system. But there is the human element to it. And so as an interpreter, like we add value to that human element. And healthcare invests so much in that with waiting rooms and just the feel goods and the music and the equipment and their specialists. Which organization has this specialist that's the only in the area, and all of that is valuable because as consumers, we want to have that available to us. But why invest in all of that and then have a patient population that you really can't serve completely? And if you're going to be an interpreter, it's not about the dollars. You're there for a human reason, and it's a purpose. And it's not to take over. It's not to insert. It's to allow adults to be adults and humans to be humans and to foster that relationship. I don't know how I got started on that one, but There's a lot that goes into it, but it's a great thing. Why do you like interpreting? You've been interpreting for, I started in 98. We're in 22. So we'll finish up with this. I just want to know why Erin still likes interpreting. And what, like...
Yeah, I don't know that it's any one particular thing. I definitely like the technical aspect of it.
Okay.
I like the puzzle of figuring out how to say what somebody has said and saying that into a different language and making that end result, that segment of communication sound like it would have sounded if everybody had been speaking the same language. That is a lot of fun. Okay, so little fast fact tidbit. I was voted most likely to star in a YouTube video. Well, actually, in high school, right? You not YouTube because they didn't have YouTube back then. I just dated myself. At any rate, most likely to star in an infomercial, which would have been the closest thing to YouTube, you know, back in that day. But it's because I enjoyed bringing life to characters. I enjoyed performing. I enjoyed that type of, even though I'm an introvert, like happy to be a wallflower. But anyway, so that aspect of I find fulfillment in that in part in interpreting. But there is definitely the dynamics of people interacting with people. That is so cool. When you have people who would have, in any other setting or situation, no business having any interaction one with the other, they find themselves in a situation when they are, communicating one with the other, and despite having a different culture, different language background, they connect and communicate in a way that is natural and normal and at ease for them. And there's just something really kind of neat about that. I love being able to interpret humor.
Oh.
So, when people are able to show that, and I'm a dork. I have a weird sense of humor, myself. So dry sense of humor, etc. So when I can connect with and see that happen, that's incredible.
Yeah.
People
really
don't
cool.
have an opportunity, except for interpreters. We get to see all these really cool moments in people's personal and professional lives, and that I describe them as sacred moments.
They are.
That would be one aspect of what I enjoy very much about interpreting.
That's cool. I've never asked you that question before, so that was cool to
go.
know. The other thing, and I'll maybe close with this, but I don't know, as we're talking about things, the other thing that I really enjoy is working at Connecting Cultures, because what I get to do is sit down and talk to everybody, and everybody that works here has such a unique story. It's a place where people come together from all over the world, all different backgrounds, all different purposes, but it's all people that care so much about the work that we do and about each other. And to know that there was a dream almost 22 years ago. Well, the dream probably started 22 years ago, because it was about March where I'm like, I might be able to do this. But it's also, and just the interpreting community in general, the people that we've been able to meet at conferences and committees and organizations and just all of the different walks of life of people that are interpreters. And that's, kind of going back to how to become an interpreter. Anybody can become an interpreter. If you have the skill sets, you're bilingual, you have a passion, fluent, not like, hey, I can talk to the neighbor, but we talked about that earlier. But if you have the linguistic skill sets, interpreters and interpreting is just, it's just a cool group. It's a cool community to be a part of, and it's a passionate community.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people that work really, really hard to move the profession forward. And I just feel honored to still be a part of that process, and I feel honored to be able to work with you.
Well, likewise.
So with that, we'll close this one up. Thanks for listening. And if you have any feedback, comments, you want us to talk about something, questions, anything like that. We love to hear from you guys. So thanks for listening and have a great day.
Take care.